the first story, of course, is the story of what happened in the Garden of Eden with the eating of the fruit. And the best way to start is by reading the story. Just to remind you that this is an American program, I'm going to show a little video in which the story is going to be read in a really rich American accent. And you can follow the story in your books. So now I'm going to share screen, and we're going to start this little video. Just let me know if you can all see it. Thumbs up. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, I can see it.
God Almighty planted a garden in Eden in the east, and he placed there the man he had created. And God Almighty made grow from the soil every tree that is desirable to the sight and good for eating, and the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. God Almighty took the man and he put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And God Almighty commanded the man to say, "Of all the trees of the garden, eat you shall eat, and of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, do not eat of it, because on the day you eat of it, you shall die." They were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. The serpent was the most shrewd of all animals of the field that God Almighty made. And the serpent said to the woman, "No, die, you will not die. For God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be as God, knowers of good and bad." The woman saw that the tree is good for eating, and that it is lusty to the eyes, and the tree is desirable to make wise. And she took of its fruit and she ate. And she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed the leaves of a fig tree, and they made themselves girdles.
When God confronts Adam and Eve about their transgression, Adam blames his wife, and Eve blames the serpent. God, however, is not satisfied with these excuses and decrees.
To the woman he said, "Multiply, I will multiply your pain and your pregnancy. In pain you will give birth to children, and to your husband will be your desire, and he will rule over you." And to Adam he said, "Cursed is the soil on your account. Painfully you shall eat of it all the days of your life. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread, until you return to the soil, as from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." God Almighty made coats of skin for Adam and his wife, and he clothed them. And God Almighty said, "Here, the human has become like one of us, to know good and bad. And now, perhaps he will send forth his hand, and he will take also from the tree of life, and he will eat and live forever." And God Almighty sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the soil wherefrom he was taken.
Well, there you are. You have the story. For some, it is a myth. For others, it's a fairy tale. For others, it's a story that they believe in, but they don't understand. Everybody takes the story in their own way, but pretty much everybody will know the story. The question is, what does it mean? What lies behind it? And what does it say to us? We have a number of questions about the story, but a little experiment on Zoom. invite you to ask some of your questions if you want first, before we begin to look at some of the other questions that we have. Anybody like to ask a question over here? Just unmute and ask your question. It's all there for you. You all sort?
Rabbi Shlomo?
Yes.
Are you content with the translation? Or are some of the phrases arguable?
One can never be content with translation. And by the way, Tom, you are absolutely on the ball, on spot on. What is key to this passage over here is the translation. And much of what we're going to be looking at tonight is going to depend upon the translation of one single word in this whole episode. We'll come to that. By the way, what was the fruit?
Don't know. Looked
Didn't
like
you see?
figs. It looked like a fig.
Didn't they? But hang on a second, wasn't it an apple?
Yeah, the story was always that it was an apple. But that's just American translation into a fig. They don't give a fig about. They don't give a fig about an apple.
Careful now, we have Americans with us and they're going to get very offended if you start this kind of stuff.
I've got an American grandson, so I love them all, but I know what they're like.
Lydia, my sister, Lydia, you have unmute. Yes? Well,
May I
can't hear you because you're muted. Okay.
May I throw in a question?
Eleanor, you have a question?
I thought it looked like a pomegranate, because pomegranates, I don't know if they appear elsewhere in the Old Testament. I know they crop up in the New, so it looked like a pomegranate.
Ah, right. Okay. Anybody else?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
If you're God and you're making the Garden of Eden, and you don't want Adam and Eve to eat these two trees, why put them there? Just don't put them in the garden. If you need to have them, put them somewhere else, and there never would have been a problem.
I don't know. You're just too clever for one person. You should have been twins. Anyone else?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yes. At the end, it said that they would eat from the tree of life and they would live forever or something. But we don't know whether they did or didn't. Did they?
They were banished from the garden after they ate from the tree of knowledge in order to prevent them from eating from the tree of life. And that's a very good question, Michael. And we'll come back to that in one of the points that we're going to make.
Okay.
All right. I want, just in the interest of time, to ask a number of questions. We have 7 questions that we're going to ask tonight. And we're going to try and see if we can get answers to all of them. And by the way, these 7 questions are all in your booklet on page 9, if I'm not mistaken. They're all listed over there, but I'm going to go through them one by one. Okay. The first question is a very obvious one. How does the eating of the fruit of a certain tree impart knowledge? I mean, what is this? Is this this apple or this fig or whatever it is? Is it a magic mushroom? You eat it and things kind of like happen inside your head? For goodness sake, they ate a fruit with all of these consequences. What does that mean? That's our first question. And now we come to Leslie's question. Why was the tree forbidden? I mean, doesn't God want us to enjoy the gifts of life? The Torah describes the tree of knowledge in these glowing terms. It's good for eating. It's lusty to the eyes, or desirable to the eyes. It's desirable to make a person wise. So why forbid a person from eating something which has such enchanting effects? This is a fantastic outcome. Everybody would want to have that kind of outcome. Why say no? Nachmanides, in your text over here, you'll find this on page 5. Nachmanides actually asks this question himself, and you'll see who Nachmanides is. In the interests of time, you can read about our source over here, but it reads as follows. The author of the source you can read about, but his words are as follows. Text number 2, yes? If the tree was so good to eat and so attractive as a source of wisdom, why did God withhold it from man? Because God is good and beneficent. So why does he withhold goodness from those who want to live in a wholesome way? Nice question. Question number 3. Isn't knowledge a good thing? I mean, what do we hear here? If you eat from this tree, you're going to gain knowledge. For goodness sake, we spend thousands of pounds educating our children to have knowledge, putting them through the best schools, university, everything else, cramming their heads with knowledge. Everybody wants knowledge. So why would you not want knowledge? And why would it be a sin or the result of a sin if you have knowledge? Now, Maimonides, in your text number 3, on page 6, puts this question very nicely. And it's the beginning of his famous book called Moreh Nevuchim, The Guide to the Perplexed. We're reading the English because it's just easier for us all to understand. Some years ago, he says, a learned man asked me a great question. It would appear from a basic reading of the Torah's words that the human being was originally intended to be like the rest of animal creation, without intelligence in his mind and without the ability to distinguish between good and bad. And that Adam's disobedience is what procured him the great perfection that is the uniqueness of a human being. It thus seems very strange that the punishment for his disobedience should be the elevation of man to the pinnacle of perfection that he did not previously have. So you sin and you get rewarded. This is like saying that a certain person, says Maimonides, was disobedient and extremely wicked, and therefore his nature was changed for the better, and he was placed as a star in the heavens. That's a good question. The key question for us is actually question number 4. Did Adam and Eve have free choice before they ate from the tree? Now, this is actually a very deep question. So let's just take it step by step to unpack the nature of this question. So free choice seems to be the key of humanness. Look at the words of, let me read you, I don't think you have this text, but I'll read you this text again from Maimonides about the nature of free choice. Freedom of choice has been granted to every person. If a person wants to turn to the path of good and be righteous, the choice is theirs. And if a person wants to turn to the path of evil and to be wicked, the choice is theirs. This concept is a fundamental principle and a pillar of the Torah and its commandments. As it is written, see, I have given before you this day life and good and death and evil, and you choose. Were God to decree that a person should be righteous or wicked, and they were then to do something in the essence of their nature, then why would you, there's no choice over there. Why would you ever punish them? They've done something which they have no choice in. That's the way they're made. So you see, free choice is the basis of all morality. But in order to make a choice, you have to have knowledge. An ignorant choice is not a choice. So before you can make a choice, you need to know what the nature of the choice is. You need to know both sides of it. If I do this, then that, and if I don't do this, then that. In other words, you can't make a choice without knowing which decision is a good one and which decision is a bad one. So choice is the underpinning of reward and punishment, of morality, of everything in the world. What did God have in mind when he created the first human beings before they ate from the tree? Were we people who had no choice? And if we had no choice, then what was life about? What kind of life is it if you never have to make a choice? So we have a fundamental problem over here. And there's a second part to this conundrum over here. They had to make a choice in order to be able to decide whether they're going to eat from the fruit or not. So it seems that they have choice of good and evil and a knowledge of good and evil even before they eat from the tree. So what's the whole story about? That after they ate from the fruit of the tree, they knew good and evil. I think you've got a little picture over there in your books, figure number 1.1 on page number 7. It's the Magdavna's parable of the locked box. He says, imagine a pile of coins locked inside a box, and the key to the box is also in the box. So how would the box be opened? By the same token, the tree held all the desires in the world, including the desire to those desires. You get it? To eat that fruit, you had to have a desire. But the desire is a result of eating the fruit. So it's a real puzzle. It doesn't stack up. The whole thing doesn't make sense. So where did their desire to eat from the tree come from? Question number 5. Everything that the serpent said was true. So where was its deception? Now, you've got a little in your books again on page number 8, figure 1.2. Let's see what the serpent said in Genesis chapter 3, verses 4 to 5 on the left-hand side. The serpent said to the woman, "No, you will not die. For God knows that on the day that you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be as God, knowers of good and bad." That's what the serpent said. What was the outcome? What did God say? Genesis chapter 3, verse number 22 on the right-hand side. God Almighty said, "Here the human being has become like one of us, to know good and bad. And now perhaps he will send forth his hand, and he will also take from the tree of life, and he'll eat, and he'll live forever." So essentially, God is affirming all of the serpent's claims. God confirms that by eating from the tree, Adam and Chava will become like God, and now they'll know good and bad, just like the serpent said. Even the serpent's statement, "No, you will not die," seems valid, because God himself says that if Adam and Chava will live forever if they eat from the tree of life. And it's only because he banished them from the garden that they're prevented from that happening. So why does the serpent get schmeiced? What did it do wrong? Told the truth. By the way, there's another way you can ask this question. God's complaining now that the human being has become like one of us, right? That's his complaint.
Yes.
But remember a little bit earlier in the Bible, he says, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness." In other words, he created a human being to be like him, and now he's complaining that we like him. That's not fair. Finally, questions 6 and 7, the last 2 questions that we want to ask here tonight. Why did eating from the tree cause death, the pain of childbirth, and the struggle to earn a living? You know that when you punish a child, the punishment has to fit the crime. Otherwise, there's no sense in it. Yes, the child has to know that this is because of that. And the punishment has to be proportionate and appropriate. You eat a fruit and you get all of this punishment. That doesn't seem right. It seems completely disproportionate to the act.
Sorry, I can't do that.
And our final question. Nakedness and clothing and shame seems to be an integral part of this whole story over here. First of all, the Torah says they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. And then they eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and the very first thing that happens is they know that they're naked, and they act to cover themselves. And then the Torah says that before banishing them from the garden, God makes coats of skin for Adam and his wife, and he clothed them. So what's the connection between clothing and the shame, and what's it got to do with the tree of knowledge? At any rate, we have a number of questions over here, and we're going to spend the rest of our time this evening trying to answer them. There are actually a lot more questions, but we've got a handful even just with these. Let's have a go. By the way, once again, if you want to keep these questions in front of you, you've got them on page number 9.
Yes.
So Michael was absolutely right about the translation. Was it Michael? Somebody else asked about the translation. Oh. There's one word over here in this whole story that is absolutely key. They ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Eitz hada'at tov v'ra. So I ask you, what is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? Are there different kinds of knowing? If I know, for example, that the earth is round, is that a different kind of knowing to the way in which I know my family? If I know an obscure fact, is that the same as knowing something which is very important to me, as opposed to simply a fact? So we have this word that we use in English called knowledge. And we need to try and understand it in its biblical context, its Hebrew word, because that's going to be the key to unravel everything here tonight in terms of unlocking this entire story for us. We normally translate the word da'at as knowledge, but we need to define it in its own special context. And we need now to move to something a little bit more mystical in order to be able to see what da'at actually means. And I'm going to ask you to take a look on your page number 10 at figure 1.4. Figure 1.4 is a picture, a schemata of the 10 sefirot and the 10 faculties of humanness. Now, we're not going to be going into these in detail tonight because that's not our subject. But suffice to say for the moment that these are, in Kabbalistic terms, the building blocks of the world. It's the DNA of the way in which the world is constructed, the way in which the Almighty God, the infinite, connects with the finite through these 10 sefirot. And that built, when we talk about it, a person being created in the image of God, what we mean is that this pattern of these 10 powers or forces or attributes that are present in the universe are embedded within human beings as well. So that the way in which we function and operate is around these 10, this is our spiritual DNA, okay? Now, all that we need to look at tonight is to understand that in the structure of a human being, there is intellect, emotions, and behavior. You see that down the side over there? So you see that chokhmah, which we translate as wisdom, and bina, which we translate as understanding, are intellect, and the power of love and of giving, or of fear and of restraint, and of compassion are the primary emotions, because human beings are drawn to those things that cause them pleasure, and they retract from and distance themselves from those things which cause them pain, so that love and fear are the two drivers, the reins that direct us in our lives. And then they move down then into kind of certain kinds of behaviors. And here we have right in the middle, under chokhmah on the right-hand side, and bina on the left-hand side, we have this word da'at. Okay? This is the same da'at that we have when we talk about the Eitz HaDa'at Tov Bara, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So what is the function of this da'at, which we call knowledge because we don't have a better way to actually translate this word? So what is clear from this diagram over here is that da'at appears to be a connector between the stuff which is happening at the intellectual level and the things which are happening at the emotional level. Can you see that da'at sits under chokhmah and bina, and it sits above chesed and gevura? And it is a connector between them because the little lines connect them all. So this is the map of the 10 faculties. It's a map of the human psyche. And these 10 faculties derive from the 10 sfirot, the divine attributes that define God's relationship with his creation, and which constitute the 10 spiritual building blocks of creation and of reality. What we need to see over here is the way in which da'at operates. So chokhmah, which we translate as wisdom, is the way in which human beings can conceive a new idea. It's something which is very unique to the human species, to come up with new creative ideas. And then to understand and to analyze those ideas is the process of bina. Those are the intellectual functions of a human being, the capacity to understand, to grasp, to innovate, to come up with ideas, to expand those ideas. Da'at is what we're calling knowledge. In its technical term, in its technical sense, it means the ability to relate to ideas and to apply them to ourselves. Da'at is what makes that knowledge significant to us. That's the function of da'at. And on page number 11, in text number 4, just to simplify this fantastically, there's a little story that it tries to explain what da'at does in the inside of us. So an official-looking letter adorned with stamps and seals arrives at a small wayside inn somewhere in the backwoods of Russia. And the illiterate innkeeper runs to find the local school teacher in order to enlist his assistance because he can't read it. As the teacher reads the letter aloud, the innkeeper turns white, utters a small cry, and faints because the letter contains shocking and tragic news for this very simple, good-hearted man. His beloved father has passed away. So now that's the story. Let's analyze this event. Why does the innkeeper react so dramatically to the letter while the teacher is relatively unmoved? Who understands the letter better? The literate person who can read and who can comprehend what it is saying, obviously the teacher. The innkeeper can't even read or write. But it's not the teacher who faints. It's the innkeeper who faints. Why? And the answer is very simple. It's not the teacher's father who died. And therefore, the knowledge, the piece of knowledge, the da'at, that is connecting his mind and his heart, affects the one person in a way which is completely different to the other. The da'at for the person whose father has died is powerful. It means something. That knowledge is not abstract knowledge. It's real. It's visceral. And it has an impact upon him. Of course, the teacher is also impacted by the knowledge. He feels some compassion, sorrow, but it's not visceral. It doesn't get him in the solar plexus because it's not his dad. So that's the key to what da'at means. Da'at is the way in which a piece of knowledge translates and connects with a person's feelings, things which are happening at another level inside of us. It's the way in which a piece of knowledge will impact and affect our emotions. That is why it is the connector between intellect, brain, and heart. Okay? Now, we're going to pause here for a moment, and I'm going to ask you some questions for a bit of discussion for another few moments. Does this faculty of da'at, the way in which our emotions are affected by the things that we learn or that we know, does that help or hinder us when it comes to making major life decisions? Let me give you a couple of examples just to get the discussion going. Who can better diagnose an illness? An objective professional, or a doctor who is a close friend and deeply cares about the patient and is very upset and moved by his friend's illness? Who's going to make the better diagnosis? That's question number one. Case number two. Who's going to do a better job at running a business? A high-ed genius, got top marks at one of the top business schools, a PhD in business administration, or a family member who is personally and emotionally invested in the business? Who's going to run the business better of these two people? And question number three. Who would be a better judge in a criminal case? A computer that's fed all of the relevant facts and algorithms, or a human judge with feelings of sympathy for the victim and outrage towards the criminal? Let's have some of your views for a moment.
Can I speak about the first one that you mentioned, Shlomo?
Yes.
You see, I think both doctors could make the diagnosis, but one doctor will not be emotionally involved, if you like, and the other doctor obviously will. But his emotional involvement shouldn't prevent him making the correct diagnosis. He may, after he's made that diagnosis, be emotionally involved and upset and show some feeling which could have an effect on the patient. And the one who's not involved might walk off and not have that emotional feeling. And I think that if you are a professional, your emotional feelings and attitude should not influence your diagnosis, but how you as the person feels, that's another matter.
All right, let's ask Michael, who's a doctor, if you'd like to answer this question here. Who's going to make the better diagnosis, the one who's emotionally involved or the one who's completely dispassionate?
I think the dispassionate one.
Yes, okay, all right, fine, okay. And in the other cases, who's going to run their business better? The one who really cares about it is my business.
Yes.
I'm really involved in it.
The professional.
The professional, you reckon so?
Yeah. I think sometimes bringing families into family businesses can be the end of the family business.
Okay, what about the case of our judgment over here?
The computer.
Now, are there any virtues in subjectivity? Is objectivity always just the better way to do it? Or is subjectivity sometimes helpful as well?
When it's a matter of life and death.
Subjectivity.
Life and death.
Yes, David, that's when you'd say subjectivity is important.
Yeah.
Surely you need a bit of both.
They say that a mother always knows what's wrong with the child, even if the doctor doesn't. That's a point.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. All right.
Sanhedrin never decided.
I think feelings are absolutely critical in everything that we do and navigate, and it has to be a combination. And actually, if you
hang on a second, David. Carry on, Joanna.
I was thinking, even in the situation with the doctor, or if you're the patient and you're following your feelings, you then ask a completely different question. If you're unhappy about something, you can ask, and actually then the doctor doesn't come up with this black and white scenario, comes up with another alternative. So I think paying attention to feelings and that inner knowing is everything. That's almost all we have.
Okay.
I disagree with
okay. So let's just hold it for the moment. Let's just move on, and we'll come back to some discussion shortly. What we're saying over here about da'at, and we'll come back to the tree of knowledge, it's a da'at tovara in a moment, but we're still trying to understand da'at, is that a human being is never completely objective towards anything that we engage in, because we are all affected by the things that we know. Even in those cases of the people who are seemingly objective in their examples, but they also have knowledge, and those knowledge have informed their opinions. Take the judge, for example, the judge's circumstances of life, the things that he or she have been exposed to, etc. All of those things, that knowledge is not neutral. The knowledge is not inside of us completely and totally objective. There's always a dimension of subjectivity, even when we think that we're being completely objective, because of who we are, because of the nature of knowledge, the way in which knowledge becomes internalized and affects us and connects our brains to our emotions. We are sentient human beings. We have attitudes which are not purely intellectual. Anybody who considers himself to be completely, I'm 100% logical, coldly logical, then you're not human, I'm sorry. You're making a mistake. And you're not a human being. Now, there's another building block we need to put in over here. One of the reasons why knowledge in the Torah is referred to as food for the soul is because King David says, your Torah is in my innards. It's like I've eaten it. It's because like any other food, you eat the food, your body grows and changes from it. You bring in knowledge, it changes who you are, changes your attitudes, changes your outlooks. Now, God also has da'at. Remember that these 10 sfirot are not just a human imprint. They are the building blocks of creation. They are actually part of the structure that God brings into the world. So God has da'at as well. But there is a fundamental difference between the da'at of a human being and the divine da'at. And it's put beautifully in your text number 5 on page 13 by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Once again, I leave it to you to find out about our author. It's all there for you. This is the meaning of what God says after Adam and Eve ate from the tree. When he says, here the human being has become like one of us. Meaning that in the same way that in the supernal oneness, there is a knowledge, da'at, of good and bad, so too man has gained this knowledge as a result of eating of the tree of knowledge, in which good and bad are commingled. But for man, this da'at that he has acquired is damaging. The way it is above is that although the bad is also known, the knowledge of good and bad, for God it remains, the bad is separate and distant from the good. But the human being, because we internalize our knowledge, when we know the bad, when we engage for the first time and we understand the tree of knowledge of good and bad, and now we have da'at, and that da'at means that the knowledge of the good and bad has changed. It's now inside of us. The human being knows the bad has become mixed up with it. It extremely becomes difficult to separate from the bad. It's a huge battle inside of us now. Good and bad now have become commingled because they're inside of us. This is why God didn't want that man should taste of the tree of knowledge. God wanted man not to have this kind of knowledge of bad. He wanted man to have knowledge of a different kind. He didn't desire man to be cast into this great battle in which he has to deal with good and bad from inside. So God creates both good and bad. He creates good as the vehicle through which he chooses to make himself present in the world. And he creates bad as something outside of there to be rejected, defeated. And God knows himself both the good and the bad, but when God knows good and bad, he's unaffected by it. He transcends it. The bad doesn't touch him. It's just external knowledge. This is good, that's bad. I'm completely dispassionate. I'm not affected by the bad. But everything that we know becomes part of us. So when the first man and woman chose to act in a manner that was contrary to what God desired, the knowledge of negativity in the world was no longer objective. It was no longer technical knowledge. Before they ate from the tree of knowledge, they understood good, bad, they're both outside of me. They don't touch me. I know what my task is. I've got to focus on the good and I've got to keep away from the bad. That's a no-go area. Don't go there. That's easy. That's what I've been told. Don't go there. But once you've acquired that knowledge from inside, it's no longer so easy to say, don't go there anymore. Because now it's deeply inside of me. Maimonides puts this beautifully. And I want you to turn to Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, text number 6 on page 15.
Emma?
Yeah.
What seems to be happening here is a development of an idea that perhaps what happened with Adam and Eve is not, we see it as a punishment in the modern world, because death is an awful thing. But what I think, and I think Manis Friedman touched on this as well in the video that I sent you, is that it basically changed their role, changed their way of being, their state. but we are conditioned to see what happened to them as a punishment.
Okay, hold that for a moment, Andrew.
Okay.
Let's take a look at this text over here. The intelligence that God imparted to man, which is man's ultimate perfection, was actually given to him before his disobedience. Indeed, it was because of this intelligence that it is said that man was made in the divine image and likeness. And it is due to this intelligence that God spoke to man and instructed him, as one does not commission animals without intelligence, or those without intelligence. With this intelligence, man was able to differentiate between truth and falsehood. This ability man possessed in fullness and perfection. This is true, this is false. Good and bad, on the other hand, are subjective conventions, not objective truths. When speaking of the correct and the incorrect, we use the terminology true and false. Regarding what is attractive or repulsive, we use the terms good and bad. When man rebelled and followed his imagined desires and the pleasure of his physical instincts, as it is written, the woman saw that the tree is good for eating and that it's lusty to the eyes, the punishment was to be deprived of objective understanding. He was inundated by the subjectivity of worldly conventions, and he sank to the level of discerning things in terms of good and bad. And that's what it means when it says that Adam and Eve became knowers of good and bad, rather than knowers of falsehood and truth, or comprehenders of falsehood and truth. What Maimonides is saying over here is something terribly important. Good and bad is not the same as truth, as true and false. Good and true don't mean the same thing, and bad and false don't mean the same thing. A human being can see something that is false and call it good, or something which is good and call it false. The objectivity to distinguish between true and false was what we had before we stretched out our hand to eat the fruit. Because our knowledge, we didn't have diet yet, it was external. Our perception of the world was external. It didn't touch us. We could be completely and totally objective. From the moment that we engaged in that process of eating the fruit, in other words, it's not the fruit. Don't blame the messenger. It's got nothing to do with the apple or the fig. What happens over here is that in giving in to the desire, to the lust, one has opened a Pandora's box of human emotion. One is changed forever from inside. One can no longer ever be objective, because I'm always going to be driven somewhere deep down inside me by what I like, by what I want, by what I need, by what satisfies me. And that is always going to confuse the issue of whether it is right or wrong. It's never going to be clear. That's what happens when you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It becomes subjective and is never clear again. So that's the story over here. What Maimonides is saying is that good and bad are subjective conventions, describing the way in which we feel about something. If we were looking at the world through completely objective eyes, we wouldn't perceive things in terms of good and bad, but in terms of true and false, or correct and incorrect. It would be clear to us what is right and what is wrong. But now things are muddled because my emotions are getting in the way.
Shlomo?
Yes.
All they had before they ate the apple was truth and the ability to differentiate truth from falsehood, right? There was no subjectivity. They were not open to subjectivity before they had
correct
of knowledge.
It was there, the possibility of subjectivity was there, and that's what they succumbed to.
Right, but it was outside, and all they had was truth and falsehood.
Exactly.
And they were told definitively that if you ate from the tree, you would die. So that truth, in the absence of any subjectivity or being driven by emotion, should have kept them away.
It should have, but they succumbed to the lust, they succumbed to the desire. They had free choice, but it was a different kind of free choice. It was a free choice of God says, this you can do, that you can't do. And they know they've got a choice over there, but it's an external choice. It's not one which is subjective at all. It's absolutely pristine, clear. It is, yeah, Eleanor.
But the consequences were clear, though.
Until the serpent came along and told them that the consequences were not so clear. Eleanor?
Okay, so God is omnipotent. That is why God is able to create heaven and earth and everything. Doesn't this turn on the issue of disobedience so that their disobedience turned them into adults as opposed to God-fearing children? And the big test was whether they could remain God-fearing children or whether they had the hubris to want to be powerful, because knowledge is power, and challenge God's omnipotence.
Absolutely right, Eleanor. And I'll put this to you in a question in just a moment when I just make one more point over here. I just want to point out over here that remember that the reason why this comes to them from the snake is because it has to be something from outside. It's not yet internalized. So the story tells us about a temptation which comes from outside, not one which comes from inside. Okay. And that you'll see on page 17 in text number 7, the transgression isn't in reality, post-transgression is an internal voice. I want, I desire. That wasn't the original state of the human being, okay? Which is why the serpent had to come from outside to entice man.
But how do we know it was a snake?
Oh, it doesn't matter. Forget whether it's snake or not. It's okay. So another question is, where's the serpent's deception? Okay. And the answer is in text number 8 on page 18, taken from the Zohar. Is this our, God Almighty took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it, to work it. These are the positive commandments. To keep it, these are the prohibitions. They knew there were positive actions and negative actions. But they had no, again, emotional attachment to anything negative. So the snake says to them, you're going to become like God. Yes, you'll have da'at like God. But the deception is, it's very subtle. Actually, you're not quite like God. God can handle da'at because he remains objective. You, when you attain da'at, will no longer be objective. And so there is a subtle deception in the snake, in the serpent's argument over here. I just want to move on to the question now of Eleanor's issue over here. Here's a little thought experiment, okay? So let's just summarize for a moment. There's a state prior to the eating of the tree, of the fruit. The world is very clear. It's black and white. We understand this is good and therefore follow this path. This is bad and stay away from it. And Adam and Eve understand this clearly. They can see it with the clarity of perception. I know what's right and I know what's wrong. But they decide from their urges, from deep down inside, that they can't actually handle that, and they now eat from the tree. And from that point onwards, it becomes a struggle in which good and bad becomes confused with right and wrong, and it is a much bigger problem. Now, the fundamental question for us is, which of the two worlds is the better one? Is the world that God originally intended, with that pristine clarity, a better world? Or is the world in which we landed up in post-transgression a better world? And here is a little thought experiment to try and clarify this question. You have a child, and you have two ways in which you can raise this child. Option number one, you can raise your child in a perfect utopian world, never expose them to anything that is evil or horrible or negative or ugly. They will experience only goodness and beauty. They will be taught how to protect the goodness and the beauty in their world. They'll be taught how to make the world more beautiful and to make it better. They'll be challenged to use their talents and their abilities to achieve this goal, and will achieve fulfillment and satisfaction in accomplishing it. And they'll always know that there's evil over there, but they'll never encounter it. They'll never have to engage with it. They'll know that that is something, it's a no-go area. Don't go there. It's not a good place to be. And they will be blind to it. They will never have tasted it. They've never have experienced it. That's option number one. Option number two, you allow your child to experience evil and to be subject to temptations. Because one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to be corrupted by it, or they're going to struggle against it, and they're going to come out on the other side, and they will have grown from the experience. They will have known what it means to struggle. They will have known what it means to suffer. But they will have the satisfaction of having defeated evil and the satisfaction of transforming the world. One of these situations describes the state before Da'at. The second describes what happens after Da'at. What do you want for your child? Or indeed, what would you prefer for your life of these two options? Tell me.
The first option sounds very boring to me.
Quite nice and peaceful, actually.
Option two is better. Yeah, I don't think pretty honest. Yeah, option two is the better one. But what is not explained is what God wanted. If God is so omnipotent, why did he, in fact, allow Eve to eat the apple?
Because he brought, because free choice was brought into the world. Did he?
Well, I think he might have been foreseeing the future through these activities, because we know that further down, he created the Torah and created the Jewish nation to repair the world. And maybe in allowing us to be open to seeing some of the evil, he's already planting a seed for us to move towards that direction.
So
right, indeed.
Wanted to plant, in fact, that seed is what you're saying. God wanted Eve to take the apple.
Yes.
Well, he gave free choice.
Through adversity and struggling, it makes us better people.
God being so omnipotent, he must have known what Eve was going to do before she did it.
He knew what choice to give us, but he also knew what the outcome would be. He didn't force Adam and Eve. They had free choice. They could have done it themselves. He could foresee, of course, what the outcome would be. And as Lydia said, then put in place various kinds of mechanisms to repair the world. In other words, Torah and et cetera, et cetera. But you see, it's a little bit worse than that, because according to our texts, from the Kabbalistic texts, this change that happens inside a person in which good and bad, right and wrong, truth and falsehood now are all confused, and we've moved from a world of black and white into a world of gray, where nothing is quite certain, where everything is slightly tainted, where everything has a little bit of the other, where it becomes so difficult sometimes to be able to know what the right thing is to do, to have clarity of thought. It is so confusing sometimes. And this is an impact which happens not just inside the person, but according to the Arizal, the great Kabbalist, as told by his student who wrote his works, Reb Chaim Vital, this actually has a cosmic impact as well. I just want you to turn to page number 19, text number 9. Know that after Adam sinned and ate from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, both his soul and body became integrated with both good and bad, and the significance of which is written, because on the day that you eat from it, die you will die, both the death of the soul and the death of the body. And when he sinned with the tree of knowledge of good and bad, man caused this intermixing in all the worlds. So there's nothing that does not include within itself good and bad. In other words, from this moment onwards, there's mishmash. The world is a mishmash. Nothing is clear anymore. Says the Lubavitcher Rebbe in text number 10 on page 20, as a result of the sin of the tree of knowledge, there was a blending of good and bad. Evil existed before the sin, but then it was separated from the good. As it is known that in the beginning of creation, the domain of Klippa, the husks that conceal godliness, were beneath the realms of holiness. But through the sin of the tree of knowledge, the entire world became a mixture of good and bad. The bad is mixed into the good, and the good is mixed into the bad. And to the extent that there's no good without some bad in it, and no bad without some good in it. So the world becomes a very challenging place. And our own decision-making becomes very challenging. Because in every situation that we look at, we're never quite sure, because of this subjectivity of da'at that's inside of us now, whether the decisions we're making are the right decisions, the wrong decisions, whether it's for the good, whether it's for the bad. And you can argue it both ways, because you'll find, and that's exactly what happens when you come to a court of law, everybody puts up their arguments. Everybody's right. Everybody has a point. It's no longer clear. There's no clarity that this is right, that's wrong. We have moral ambiguity in the world. We have moral ambiguity within ourselves, because we are a bunch of emotions, and our knowledge affects and impacts upon our knowledge through da'at, and is no longer clear. That's the impact of the tree of knowledge. And that's why the punishments that we're talking about over here are actually the results of their deed. Because up until then, the world would have been a nice place of goodness in it, you know, but from that point onwards, when there's moral ambiguity, everything becomes difficult. Everything is a struggle. We live in a world of struggle. We live in a world in which we're constantly having to deal with hard decisions, with things which impact upon our lives, where they really sometimes very difficult things that we have to deal with. This idea of the difficulty of bringing life into the world, the difficulty of toil, of struggle, of the energy to work with the world, to work with the soil as a metaphor, etc. All of that is the direct impact of da'at entering into a person, being acquired by human beings. It doesn't mean to say that a finite life can't have clarity and harmony, but it's much more difficult. And that's why there's also sometimes a feeling of shame, because when there's moral ambiguity and one knows that sometimes one has done, perhaps not made the right decision, it brings about a sense of shame, an awareness of self. When one does things which are inappropriate, we have a conscience about it now, because we're not 100% certain. Did we do it with the right intention? Did we do it with the wrong intention? Did we do the right thing? Did we do the wrong thing? All of those sorts of questions. So shame comes into the world. And an awareness of body. Sexuality is no longer just a clear matter of procreation or whatever. Now it's a matter of lust and of enjoyment and of engagement. But you're all absolutely right that the benefit, the upside that comes as a result of eating from the tree of knowledge is that if you ask yourself the question, would I prefer to be a dispassionate human being standing on the outskirts of society, watching the struggle, disengaged from it, above it? Or do I, as a human being, want to engage? Do I want to be involved? Do I want to be part of the struggle? Is that part of my humanness? Is that part of my sense of satisfaction, my sense of achievement in life, that I've struggled and that I've prevailed, that I've engaged with the world, that I've overcome those things which come pouring at me in life from all sides, with all the difficulties of raising families, of living a life, of dealing with relationships that work, relationships that don't work, all of the mess of life, all of the engagements with friends and so many different situations. Where would we prefer to be? And I think the answer for all of us is that actually we prefer to be on this side of the tree of knowledge. That's the funny thing. The other side looks great. We might even want it for our children, but it's not real. It's not what makes us human. And it's not what we admire in each other. Because when we see human beings who suffer and rise above it, we see human beings having everything thrown at them and they rise above it and they smile, we say, my goodness me, if only I could be like that. If only I could deal with what life has thrown at me and all of its challenges and all that it has offered to me and all that it has denied to me. If I could rise above that, if I could live my life and come out at the end of it and say, I engaged with the world, I was involved, I struggled, but look, I made it. So actually, in a funny kind of way, there was a kind of a reward for eating from the tree of knowledge. It threw us into that world of gray, the world of struggle, the world that we have to deal with all the time. And we understand ourselves a little bit better as a result of this. Now we understand actually that we're not objective human beings, that we are feeling, that sometimes we can't make the right decisions. We don't always make the right decisions. And therefore, I'd like to offer a few takeaways from our session this evening. We have actually answered most of the questions. You come back to them, you'll see that there are answers to them, which, because I don't think it's a great idea online to spend, you can spend an hour and a half in a physical shiur, but online it gets a little bit boring. So I'm not going to go through all of the answers, but the answers are there once we've understood what diet means. And it's there in some of your summary as well. But I want instead to look at a few sort of takeaways. and offers a couple of suggestions. So the first is politics, polarized positions. If side is the good side A is the good side, and side B is the bad side, then nothing about the bad side can be good. And nothing on the good side can be bad. And if you are a follower, for example, of the American elections going on right now, if you tune into Fox, you'll hear one story. If you tune into CNN, you'll hear another story altogether. And you won't even be quite certain you're talking about the same human beings in the same election. Because there is the presumption that one is all good and the other is all bad. And folks, what we've just learned is that that's not the way our world works. Good and bad are now intermingled. And there'll be a bit of some good on both sides and some bad on both sides. And there's no such thing as only good and only bad. That's talking about pre-Garden of Eden. That's one takeaway. Sometimes we become very disillusioned with people that we respect and we admire, and that we believed in, when we discover that they have some moral failings or worse. We feel very, very let down. Or we become very confused when ideologies or practices that we can know to be wrong seem to have some positive aspects in them. But that's just what life post the tree of knowledge world is all about. There isn't only good and there isn't only bad. Life is actually about trying to sort out the good from the bad and redeeming the elements of creation where they need to be redeemed. And there isn't a human being that has only good and only bad. And one shouldn't be surprised or disillusioned when somebody you admired actually shows that they have some negative sides to their character as well. Because heck, what do you expect now? Good and bad are all mixed up. But most importantly, we get very, very frustrated with some of the complexities of life. Why does everything have to be just so hard? Why do we have to deal with all of this rubbish? Couldn't God have made a simpler world? I think we know the answer now. There was a simpler world. We just didn't choose it. And actually, this is the one we prefer to be in. We've more or less all admitted it. So it's the lack of clarity which makes our lives meaningful. That's the paradox of this whole thing. It is the lack, I say it again, it is the lack of clarity that makes our lives meaningful, because we struggle and engage with all of our being to try and find that clarity for ourselves and for our lives. And just one final takeaway over here. I guess the story of the tree of knowledge helps us to be able to deal with some of the mess ups in our own lives. Things that have bugged us, things we've done wrong in the past, and it's hanging in over there and just doesn't let us go. We feel so badly about them. So we try to justify our misdeeds out of a feeling of, well, you know, if it was bad, then it's always going to be bad. There's nothing I can do about it. But if we understand ourselves a little better and understand that actually we are a whole big messed up bundle of confused good and bad, right and wrong, and everything else, and that is what makes us human, and that is what we're about, then we can look back at our pasts, at who we are, and we can say, okay, I can move on from there. I understand why. I don't have to beat myself and flagellate myself because I found something in me that I didn't like about myself. That's no surprise, because I'm not an objective human being. I am very complex, and my life is very complex. My relationships are very complex. My relationship with my spouse is complex, with my kids are complex, with my grandchildren are complex. I'm complex when I don't have a relationship, even more complex when I don't have a relationship, and I seek one. Good and bad are no longer pristine. They're all intertwined. Life is muddy and complicated, complex and difficult, and it is a struggle. That's what happened when Da'at, subjective knowledge, came into the world and connected our heads and our hearts in the ways in which from that moment onwards, we weren't able to disentangle. And that in essence is the story of the Eitz Hada'at Tov V'Ra. Next week, we're going to deal with a flood and find out why God wanted to destroy the world and whether he's going to do it again. So if you've enjoyed tonight, or even if you haven't enjoyed tonight, but you've paid your money, may as well join me next Wednesday night as well. All right, time for just a few comments now from anybody. Anybody wants the answers elaborated to the 7 questions, or are we happy to move on?
Thank you, Shlomo. That was absolutely wonderful. That's all my comment.
Thank you, Sue. I know that I pay you a lot of money to say these things and to be the first one to say it. So.
Don't tell everyone.
Yeah.
Good night.
Very good.
Anybody else? We've been talking for a long time.
I think it answered my original question. Why did God put the trees there? I think that it's because this is what he intended. Because when you ask the question, what do you want for your children? I thought, I want my children to have the nice, easy one. But for me, I'll have the complicated one. So as we're his children, he couldn't say, look, actually, here you are. Here's a whole mess. And you're going to struggle all your life to try and sort this out. And you'll never really get it quite straight. So he made it nice, but he knew really, okay, they're going to choose that. And that gives us something to do. Otherwise, we just sit there saying, isn't this a nice garden? And let's have another piece of fruit. It made us actually human. But so God didn't make a mistake putting the trees there, and this is what he meant, and here we are.
Estelle, you deal with these issues all your life as a psychologist, etc.
No, that's not
Any comments?
Well, I think that I'm just going back to the tree, and it's just so. I think it's so important to see. I'm just trying to find which page the tree is on. Just remind me, Shlomo, which page, because I'm on page 22, but I think it was around page 9.
The questions?
No, the tree, the Sephirot.
Oh, yes. That is on page, it's on page, just looking through my notes over here.
I'm also paging through here. Why have I lost it? Page 8. Yes,
page 8?
Yes, under the box.
Okay.
No? The tree on page 8. Well, it was the placement really. Oh no, it's on mine on page
10.
Yes, it was the placement of compassion.
Yes.
And the link between Da'at and Tiferet.
Yes.
And how Da'at without Tiferet and empathy is sterile. It's not up there with wisdom and understanding, but it's got, when the Da'at is linked to both love and fear, when we've experienced these things and compassion into the picture. That also helps us, and I think that's so relevant for these times when so many of us, myself included, are feeling a lot of fear, and to understand that we can draw, if I can become objective, I can draw on my past knowledge and resilience. So, you know, that's my interpretation of it, and also of, you know, there's such ambiguities and such complexities. We can never know, I don't think.
Yes. But you see, isn't it interesting? Many of us over here will have the same knowledge, but we're all very different people. And that is because the knowledge is then modified by the da'at and the way it then impacts with our experiences and our emotions. So two people have the same knowledge, but we behave in completely different ways because of those knowledge that affects us in different ways. A piece of knowledge for you is significant. For me, it may be insignificant. Something for me that's significant, suddenly I have a memory of something which happened in my past or something like that. Suddenly that piece of knowledge resonates enormously, and I hear it banging in my head, and it informs my whole attitude. I decide, for example, let us suppose you've seen, you've seen poachers. You've had an experience, or you've seen somebody doing some terrible things, poaching, killing animals, and cutting out elephant tusks and things like that. So then you decide, I'm going to become a conservationist. As somebody who hears about it and has the same knowledge but didn't actually see it, doesn't have the same passion. The same event affects two people in different ways. This is about the way in which the knowledge which we have actually then impacts upon us and begins to interfere with our objectivity and makes us subjective. And thank God we are subjective, because that's what makes us so different. And that's what gives us the sense of interaction one with the other. It's not our brains that are interacting with each other. It's our whole being, our emotions, our connectedness.
Shlomo, I see the word knowledge almost like a tree. We call lots and lots of things with a trunk and branches and leaves trees, but every tree is really different. There are many different specimens of them. And that's what I see knowledge of. We have the knowledge, but as you say, we react differently depending on our experience, which is a word that I think should have gone in there, because experience is what makes us either subjective or objective. And that's how we dress that knowledge up. That's how it branches out, if you like, with all the different leaves, the different shapes and sizes.
Right. Eleanor?
I was just thinking that Jung, the psychologist, said that the Garden of Eden is like the unconscious paradise of childhood. So in a way, it's almost a parable of growing up, isn't it? That babies, children come in with a tabula rasa where everything is all right because, well, for most of them, or hopefully, because their parent is securing them to have paradise. And it's that gradual going away from that, which is development and growing up, isn't it?
Yeah, but you know that issue we asked about, parents and how you want to bring up your kids. If you take some Hasidic communities, Haredi communities, aren't they doing exactly what the parent, in the first instance, the parent who's trying to protect their child, don't engage with the world. It's a really messy, difficult place. Best if you remain in an enclave, speaking a different language, dressing differently, try to mix as little as possible with the outside world. Study only good things. Keep your mind away from things which are bad. You don't watch television. You don't have phones. You're not watching videos, etc. We don't want you to be exposed to this big wide world over here. and to all those nasty things of sexuality and pornography and everything else, because we want you to grow up with a certain kind of purity. So, are they wrong? Isn't that what you'd want for all of your kids?
It's wrong.
Why are we in such a hurry to throw them right into it and to expose them to everything? So kids, by the age they're 9 or 10, you know, they already have an idea of, you know, totally au fait with you know, with all kinds of, you know, with the world, drugs, sex, everything else, you know, seeing all the movies, seeing the violence, everything else. What are we doing?
Because while we're around, we can help support them and give them the tools to deal with it.
Very nice answer. Very nice answer.
Well, you need a mixture of both, really.
I think the answer is partially that it's wishful thinking to imagine that you can remain insulated from the world. It's that's an Adam and Eve kind of scenario. In the real world, you're going to have to engage. You can't escape from it. And therefore, if you're unprepared for it and you don't know how to handle it, you're going to succumb to it. So it's much better if in some kind, exactly as you say, in some kind of controlled way, one's able to introduce one's children in age-appropriate ways to issues of body, sexuality, you know, privacy, boundaries, what it means to have control, to have the policeman inside of you, you know, to be able to say no, that it's okay to say no. This is all a hugely important part of preparing our children for the real world, isn't it? And if you imagine that you're going to be able to keep them completely separated, I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, that feels like enough discussion for one night.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all for joining.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lydia. Thanks for joining us and Daniel.
Thank you.
Please go on next week.